Hello again, and welcome to part two of this two-part series on building browser-neutral automations. In the part one of this series, we built a simple automation that would work across multiple browsers, in this case, Chrome or Microsoft Edge. Before we start this automation, we would provide the robot what kind of a browser that it has to use. In part two, let's focus on how this automation was built and what are some of the things that you must keep in mind so that you do not spend too much time crafting your selectors and also at the same time add efficiency to your automation. So with that, let's get started. If you recall from part one, the robot actually opens up the UiPath.com website. It waits for the contact us link. If it found the link, it would highlight it first, and then it would click on this link to navigate to the Contact Us page. From this description or from watching the demo, you can already figure out that the robot interacts about 3 times with this link. From the functionality point of view, this is not a big deal. But how you build this functionality matters. And I'm saying that because, just as I said, you would be spending too much time maintaining this automation in the future and also making your robot a bit inefficient. So let's take a closer look at how we built this functionality of the robot's interaction with the Contact Us link. So I'm back in the studio project, and this is the same project that we discussed in detail in part one of this video series. And in part one, I had said that we need to focus on the find element activity of this particular sequence in the automation. For that, let's focus on how to use the find element activity. Usually, when you use the find element activity, you would wait for the element to appear, and based on whether or not the robot finds that element, you would go on to do certain number of activities in your automation. The find element activity can also save the element that you find. So what I have done here is I find the contact us link and then I save it in a local variable. I'm going to tell you why this is important. So once the robot finds this element, it proceeds to actually highlight that element and also click on it to navigate to the contact us page. So this is good. But what's so great about this? If you look at the highlight activity or if you look at the click activity, both of these activities can accept two kinds of input. One input is the selector, which is pretty standard. We use selectors with almost all activities in UiPath or in general, any automation tool. But the activity also accepts the element input. So the inputs can be either a selector or an element. Now, this is important because what kind of an input you provide to your activity makes your robot either move faster or slow down. So what I have done here is the highlight element and the click elements do not accept selectors. But what they do is they accept the element that we saved in the previous step. Again, the question becomes, why is this important? For that, let's go back to the UiPath page and focus again on the interaction that the robot is going to have with the contact us link. So here's what's important when you give selectors to your robot. The robot always goes back to the starting line and then proceeds to find the element on that page. Now, what do I mean by that? We already discussed that the robot interacts with this link 3 times, which means if I passed the selector to all the 3 activities that we discussed, one is the find element activity, the second is the highlight activity, and the third is the click activity. Now, if I passed a selector to each of these activities, each time the robot goes back to the starting line and then tries to find that element each time. Now, as human beings, we do not feel that difference, but for a machine, it's a whole nother thing, because each time you give the robot an instruction, the robot follows that faithfully. So again, the first time I give the robot the selector, it uses that selector to scan this page and find the contact as link. And once it finds it, you're telling the robot again to highlight the contact as link. Now, what the robot does is it goes back to the starting line, again looks for the contact as element, finds it, and then highlights it. And you might have guessed where this is going, because when you give a selector to the click activity, the very same thing happens. The robot goes back to the starting line, finds the element using the selector, and then clicks on it. Now, this might sound simple, but it is highly inefficient. And therefore, you could make the robot a bit more efficient by minimizing the amount of work you do in your automation. So let's go back to the project and see how we are minimizing our work. We are back to the project again. And what we are doing here is we are crafting this selector, and based on what we already know, we are crafting this selector only once. We come down here to the find element. We use the selector that we just crafted to find the element and store the results in an element contact as variable. This is a variable of type UI element. And then when you come down to highlight the element and also click the element, you are not telling the robot to go find the contact as link each time it does a highlight or it does a click. Instead, you are telling the robot where exactly the contact as link is before it can go and highlight or click on that link. And therefore, I again draw your attention to the fact that when I used the highlight activity, I have passed it the element that has been stored in a local variable. And likewise, I have passed it the same element when I perform the click action. For the developer, the advantage is that you are spending less amount of time to generate selectors, and you are minimizing how many selectors that you're actually producing with these expressions. That is because the more number of selector expressions you have in your automations, that is that much more work for you to maintain those expressions, which is number one. Second, you are using the selector that you produced or you crafted only once to get an element back. And once you get the element out using that selector expression, you are using that element all the way in your automation activities. So that means if your element changes, let us say, for example, tomorrow UiPath changes the name of this link to something else. Instead of contact us, they would say contact UiPath, in which case you will have to spend the time just to modify one selector. Now, you might argue, hey, I don't have to work with these selector expressions. I have the object repository. I can keep the selector in the object repository. And if UiPath changes the link, I can update my selector. That is true, but it still doesn't make your robot more efficient. And that's where we are going to talk about the second advantage. And that is the advantage in the efficiency that you're adding to the robot. Let us suppose that you're storing the selector in a settings file or in the object repository, and then you are using that selector in the find element, in the highlight element, and the click activity. It will work. There's no doubt about that, because if your selector has changed, you change that in the object repository and you recompile your application, it will still work. But as I said before, the robot is going to go back to the starting line and use the selector to find the contact as element each time you ask it to interact with the contact as link. And therefore, regardless of what methodology you're using, whether it's object repository or selector expressions or storing your selectors in an external settings file, Designing for efficiency is a slightly different game. Just because you're storing selectors in a settings file or putting them in object repository doesn't necessarily mean your automation is efficient. This is a classic case where you can eliminate repeatability and monotonous code in your automation. So you can see that as part of making the automation efficient, we have crafted this selector once, we have used it once, and that's pretty much it. That's it for this video and this two-part video series. I hope you liked this video, and if you did like it, please give it a like and please subscribe to my channel so that I can put out more videos that would help you solve your practical day-to-day RPA problems. Thank you.